Hey, so glad you got here. We were totally waiting for you. Just about to listen to a story. Tonight the fire burns low. The wind hums through distant trees, and somewhere beyond the edge of every well-drawn map lies a place so thoroughly forgotten that even wandering birds seem unsure whether they should fly over it. Imagine a kingdom where roads simply stop remembering where they lead, where old stones keep secrets better than monks, and where every sunrise feels like it has politely agreed not to disturb the silence. It is the sort of tale that slips quietly into your thoughts and settles there like warm embers after a long day. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what your local time is. It's always fascinating to imagine people all across the world sharing the same quiet story, each beneath a different sky. Now settle in, get comfortable, and just relax. Today's tale starts like this. There once was a man named Aldrin, a map maker whose greatest talent was noticing things everyone else overlooked. He was not famous, nor especially wealthy, and certainly not the sort of fellow that kings invited to banquets. In truth, the closest he usually came to royal company was drawing little crowns on maps whenever someone insisted a castle belonged to a particularly important lord. He often joked that nobles spent more time arguing over borders than sheep ever did. The sheep, after all, usually had the better sense. One cool autumn morning, Aldrin traveled along an aging trade road that had seen happier centuries. Moss crawled over old milestones, birds nested inside broken watchtowers, and every few miles stood another lonely oak that looked as though it had been patiently waiting for someone who never arrived. His mule, Brim, possessed exactly two remarkable qualities. The first was an impressive ability to find edible plants where none appeared to exist. The second was an equally impressive determination to stop walking whenever the journey became interesting. Naturally, Brim chose that very morning to freeze in place. "No," Aldrin sighed, tugging gently on the reins. "This isn't the dramatic part yet." Brim blinked once. That settled the discussion. As Aldrin searched for whatever had alarmed the animal, he noticed something peculiar beside the road. Half buried beneath ivy rested an ancient stone marker. Unlike the other milestones, this one carried no familiar crest. Instead, weathered into its surface, was a simple image, a crown. Below it, nothing. No name, no distance, only empty space where letters should have been. He brushed away dirt with his sleeve. Sometimes old carvings disappeared beneath centuries of rain. Not this time. It was almost as though someone had carefully removed every word while leaving the symbol untouched. That bothered him far more than if the entire stone had crumbled away. Mapmakers distrusted mysteries that appeared deliberate. An elderly charcoal burner emerged from nearby woods, carrying a bundle of blackened branches across his shoulders. His beard looked old enough to deserve its own walking stick. Aldrin greeted him politely. "Good day. Do you know who placed this marker?" The old man slowed. His eyes rested upon the stone, then immediately drifted away. "You saw nothing." "I am rather certain I did." "You'll sleep better pretending otherwise." Curiosity, unfortunately, is to mapmakers what shiny objects are to crows. Impossible to ignore. "What stood here?" Aldrin asked. The charcoal burner scratched his chin. "My grandfather warned me never to speak its name." "What name?" "I cannot tell you." "Because you don't know?" "Because he wouldn't say it either." The old fellow chuckled softly, adjusted his bundle, and continued along the road. As he disappeared between trees, he called back one final sentence. If the road starts looking too well kept, he paused. Turn around. Then he vanished into the forest. Aldrin stared after him. That was exactly the opposite of helpful. Still, it lingered, too well kept. By afternoon, the trade road narrowed, wheel ruts faded, grass grew higher, yet strangely, the path ahead became smoother, not rougher. The weeds retreated, loose stones disappeared. The road itself seemed almost maintained, fresh, impossible. No villages appeared nearby, no travelers passed, no carts rolled through. And yet someone had clearly repaired sections of the ancient paving within recent years. Brim snorted uneasily. You noticed it too? The mule looked offended, as though he had noticed everything long before his human companion. The silence changed. Not louder, not quieter, simply different. Forests possess their own conversations. Leaves whisper, branches creak. Birds argue over entirely unimportant matters. Here, the woodland seemed politely attentive, like listeners waiting for the storyteller to continue. Aldrin found himself lowering his own voice without understanding why. Near sunset, he discovered a bridge crossing a narrow stream. Its stones looked astonishingly clean. No moss, no cracks. Water flowed beneath with crystal clarity. Someone swept fallen leaves from its surface. Recently, he knelt beside one edge. Fresh broom marks, no older than a few days. Yet there were no footprints, no wagon tracks, no horse droppings, nothing. It felt as though invisible caretakers worked only while no one watched. A curious historical oddity drifted through Aldrin's memory. Some medieval roads were maintained not by soldiers or merchants, but by nearby monasteries, whose brothers believed that repairing bridges counted as an act of charity equal to feeding strangers. The work often went unnoticed because that was precisely the point. Good roads, like good manners, rarely attracted attention until they disappeared. He smiled. Perhaps there truly was some hidden abbey nearby. It was certainly a more comforting explanation than invisible bridge sweepers. The evening sky glowed amber. Mist began gathering over nearby fields. Aldrin decided to camp before darkness fully arrived. He unpacked bread, hard cheese, dried apples, and enough onions to discourage both wolves and overly friendly companions. Brim appreciated neither strategy. The small campfire crackled softly. Owls awakened. Stars slowly emerged overhead. Everything should have felt ordinary. Instead, the breeze carried a distant sound. Not wolves, not bells. Music. Very faint, gentle, almost too far away to hear. A flute, then another, followed by voices singing words too distant to understand. He stood. The melody lasted only moments before fading back into silence. No smoke rose above the trees. No lights flickered. Only darkness. Only forest. Only questions. Most sensible travelers would have turned around the following morning. Aldrin was many admirable things. Sensible rarely appeared on the list. Before sleeping, he unfolded his worn collection of regional maps beside the fire. Every road, every village, every stream, carefully drawn, carefully copied, carefully verified. Yet the bridge he had crossed appeared nowhere, nor did the smooth stretch of road. It simply stopped, as though every mapmaker before him had quietly decided that nothing beyond that point deserved recording. He stared into the dancing fire until the embers glowed deep red. Somewhere beyond tomorrow's sunrise waited an answer, or perhaps several hundred more questions. Either way, the forgotten road had already accomplished something remarkable. It had convinced a man whose profession depended upon certainty to willingly follow uncertainty into the unknown. The forest watched in perfect silence. And beyond its shadowed edge, unseen by traveler or mule alike, an old stone gate stood waiting for its first visitor in generations. Morning arrived with a pale ribbon of mist curling over the fields, and Aldrin awoke to the peculiar feeling that someone had already been awake for hours, not watching him, simply living nearby. It was a strange distinction, but an important one. The campfire had burned itself into a bed of warm ash. Brim was happily chewing grass, with the dedication of a scholar studying an especially fascinating manuscript, and the forest no longer carried yesterday's unsettling stillness. Instead, it seemed almost welcoming, as though it had finally decided he was not going to cause immediate trouble. That was generous of it. Aldrin packed his belongings, folded his maps, and continued along the immaculate road. Every mile made less sense than the last. The paving stones remained clean. The roadside ditches had been cleared recently. Wildflowers grew in neat patches rather than tangled chaos, almost as though someone quietly encouraged them to stay where they belonged. It reminded him of an elderly grandmother tidying a room moments before visitors arrived, except no visitors ever seemed to come. He paused beside another milestone. Like the first, it bore only the carved image of a crown. No words, no distance, no direction, just the silent emblem. Someone had erased every name, but had left every reminder that a name had once existed, that required patience and purpose. By midday, the forest began to thin. Sunlight spilled through the branches in broad golden bands, revealing rolling farmland beyond. Aldrin stopped walking. Fields stretched across gentle hills. Golden grain swayed peacefully. Stone walls divided neat pastures, where sheep grazed lazily. Thin columns of smoke rose from cottage chimneys. A watermill turned steadily beside a clear stream. Children chased one another through an orchard. The scene looked prosperous, peaceful, entirely ordinary, except it could not possibly exist. No village appeared on any map. No tax records mentioned farms here. No merchants had ever spoken of buying grain from this valley. Yet before him stood enough farmland to feed thousands. Brim wandered forward without hesitation. Apparently hidden kingdoms were less concerning than hidden grass. "Traitor," Aldrin muttered. The mule ignored him with practiced professionalism. As Aldrin descended the hill, something curious happened. The children stopped running, not from fear, from surprise. They stared openly at him. One little boy pointed. A girl whispered something into her sister's ear. None of them approached. Instead, one child sprinted toward the village, while the others remained exactly where they stood, watching. Aldrin lifted one hand in greeting. Several children cautiously waved back. One tiny fellow looked as though he was trying to decide whether travelers were real or merely stories adults invented. It occurred to Aldrin that the child might genuinely not know. The first adult he encountered was an elderly woman gathering apples beneath a broad tree. Her dress was simple, but beautifully woven. Her basket overflowed with bright fruit. She looked up as he approached, then smiled, not nervously, not suspiciously, simply with calm curiosity. "You've come from outside." It was not a question. "I believe so." We wondered if anyone still remembered the roads. Aldrin blinked. I was under the impression no one remembered this place. The old woman laughed softly. "Oh, they forgot us long ago." She handed him an apple. "But roads have memories longer than people." He accepted it. It was remarkably crisp, perhaps the finest apple he had ever tasted. He wondered if forgotten kingdoms also forgot how to grow mediocre fruit, That seemed unfair to the rest of the world. Several villagers gradually emerged from nearby homes. A blacksmith wiped soot from his hands. A baker stepped outside carrying fresh loaves. Two elderly men paused halfway through repairing a wagon wheel. None appeared frightened, only fascinated. They looked at Aldrin much as he looked at unusual landmarks, with quiet appreciation and a long list of questions. "You truly came through the Western Road?" asked the baker. "I did." "It still exists?" "It appears to." The villagers exchanged glances. One of them smiled with unmistakable relief. Another crossed himself. A third quietly wiped tears from his eyes. Aldrin frowned. "I'm afraid I don't understand." The blacksmith rested one powerful arm upon his hammer. "We always hoped the road remained." "You've never used it?" "No." "Why not?" The villagers fell silent. Finally, the elderly apple gatherer answered, "Because no one ever leaves." A breeze stirred the orchard. Leaves drifted gently between them. The sentence settled into the morning air with astonishing weight. "No one?" Aldrin asked carefully. "No one." "By law?" "No." "Choice?" The woman considered that. "Perhaps." That was somehow even stranger. A curious medieval custom came to Aldrin's mind. In many isolated communities, people believed that crossing certain old boundary stones without proper blessings invited terrible luck, not because the stones possessed magic, but because generations had attached stories to them until the stories became stronger than the stones themselves. Superstitions often lasted far longer than the reasons they began. Perhaps something similar had happened here, although somehow this felt deeper. The villagers invited him into their settlement. The cottages were beautifully maintained. Roofs had been freshly thatched. Gardens overflowed with herbs, beans, onions, and cabbage. Geese waddled importantly through narrow lanes, behaving exactly like local officials, inspecting everyone's business. One hissed at Brim. Brim hissed back. Neither accomplished anything. Order was everywhere. Wood piles stacked neatly, tools carefully stored, fences freshly repaired. Nothing looked abandoned. Nothing looked wealthy. Everything simply looked cared for. As though every person quietly accepted responsibility for the whole village rather than only their own home. The baker offered warm bread. A cheesemaker added soft goat cheese. Someone produced fresh honey. Another poured cool spring water into polished clay cups. Nobody asked for payment. Hospitality seemed less like generosity and more like routine. "You receive many travelers?" Aldrin asked. The baker nearly dropped his loaf laughing. "Oh goodness, no." "Then why prepare such a welcome?" "Because eventually someone always arrives." "When was the last traveler?" Silence returned. The villagers looked toward one another. Finally, an elderly carpenter spoke. "My grandfather met one." "And when was that?" "He was very young." Aldrin performed the calculation. That meant perhaps 70 years, maybe more. Yet they had welcomed him as though expecting guests every season. An odd warmth settled over him. These people had waited generations without becoming bitter. That required remarkable patience or remarkable hope. They continued deeper into the settlement until they reached a broad village square. At its center stood a stone fountain unlike any Aldrin had ever seen. Instead of kings or saints, it depicted ordinary people, farmers, millers, weavers, children, no rulers, no soldiers, just common folk holding hands around a great tree. Water flowed gently from its branches. "Beautiful," Aldrin whispered. "Our founders built it." "No king?" The villagers smiled knowingly. "Our king insisted." That answer somehow raised twice as many questions. Then came the sound. A bell. Deep. Steady. 3 slow chimes. Every villager paused. Not abruptly. Gracefully. Conversations ended. Work ceased. Children stopped playing. Each person turned eastward. No one spoke for nearly a full minute. The silence felt peaceful rather than solemn, like greeting an old friend. When the moment ended, everyone calmly resumed whatever they had been doing. Aldrin waited until people began walking again. What was that? The noon remembering. The what? We pause each day. To remember whom? The elderly woman looked gently at him. So we never become forgotten by ourselves. Before Aldrin could ask another question, a young messenger hurried across the square. He bowed politely. The keep has been informed. Several villagers nodded. The messenger turned toward Aldrin. The custodian requests your presence. The king? There has been no king for many generations. The queen? No queen. Then who rules? The messenger smiled. You will understand soon. He gestured toward a distant hill rising above the valley. There, partially hidden among ancient oaks, stood a magnificent stone castle. Its towers gleamed softly beneath the afternoon sun. Colorful banners drifted from its walls. Gardens surrounded its terraces. Its windows sparkled with clean glass. There were no signs of ruin, no broken battlements, no crumbling towers. It looked alive, not as a fortress awaiting war, but as a home patiently waiting for someone to return. Aldrin gazed at the castle in astonishment. Everything he believed about forgotten places suggested decay. Instead, he had found something far stranger, a kingdom that had disappeared from history without ever falling apart. The road to the castle climbed gently through orchards and terraces, each one tended with the kind of care usually reserved for newborn lambs, royal horses, or suspiciously expensive pies. Aldrin walked beside the young messenger, while Brim followed behind, pausing whenever he found a patch of grass worthy of deep personal investigation. Below them, the hidden valley spread like a secret held in 2 cupped hands. Fields shimmered gold, streams stitched silver lines through meadows. Smoke rose in soft blue threads from village chimneys. Nothing about it seemed frightened. Nothing seemed desperate. That, somehow, made the mystery larger. Forgotten places were supposed to be sad. This kingdom was not sad. It was waiting. At the castle gate, 2 guards stood in polished mail, their spears upright, their expressions serious but not unfriendly. They looked less like men prepared for battle and more like men prepared to correct poor manners at a feast. One examined Aldrin's travel cloak, then his ink-stained fingers, then Brim. The guard nodded gravely. The mule may enter. Brim accepted this honor without visible gratitude. Inside the walls, Aldrin expected bustle, commands, perhaps servants rushing about with trays, or officials pretending documents were more urgent than they were. Instead, he found quiet movement. Gardeners trimmed hedges. A woman swept fallen leaves from the courtyard. A boy carried candles toward a chapel. Somewhere, someone was practicing a lute very badly and with admirable confidence. The messenger led Aldrin into a high hall, warmed by sunlight. At the far end stood no throne. Or rather, there was a throne, but no one sat upon it. It rested beneath a canopy of faded blue cloth, polished, untouched, and strangely gentle in its emptiness. Beside it stood a plain wooden chair. Upon that chair sat an old woman wearing no crown. Her hair was silver. Her gown was dark green wool. Her hands rested calmly in her lap. She looked at Aldrin with eyes bright enough to make lying seem inconvenient. "You are the traveler from the Western Road," she said. "I am. And a map maker." Aldrin hesitated. "Yes." A small smile appeared. "Of course. Only a map maker would walk into a place everyone else forgot and immediately wonder whether the roads were properly labeled." "That is painfully fair," the old woman rose. "I am Merith, custodian of Lethrain." At last, a name. Lethrain. It moved through the hall like a candle being lit in a sealed room. Aldrin repeated it softly. The guards, messenger, and servants nearby bowed their heads, not deeply, not theatrically, simply with respect. Merith noticed his reaction. "You have never heard the name." "No." "Good." That was not the response he expected. "Good? If the outside world remembered us too clearly, you would not have arrived alone." Aldrin looked toward the empty throne. "And if it forgot you entirely, then one day even we might begin to doubt ourselves." She gestured for him to walk with her. They passed through a corridor lined with portraits. Kings, queens, princes, princesses, counselors, generals, and children stared from painted frames. Some wore jewels, some wore armor. One king appeared to have been painted with a dog sleeping beneath his chair, which immediately improved Aldrin's opinion of him. "King Audrin the Patient," Merith said, noticing his gaze. "Was he patient?" "With people, yes. With turnips, no." "I beg your pardon." "He banned turnips from court dinners for 11 years after choking on one." Aldrin nodded. History, he felt, could use more details like that. Merith continued. "Lethrain was once a small kingdom between greater realms, too small to frighten anyone, too fertile to be ignored, and too stubborn to be easily absorbed." "That sounds dangerous." It was. They entered a council chamber where a great circular table stood beneath painted beams. No single chair was larger than the others. Merith touched the table's edge. "For generations, our rulers survived by promising very little and listening very carefully. Then came the War of 3 Crowns." Aldrin knew that name. Every apprentice mapmaker learned of it. 3 neighboring kingdoms had fought over inheritance, trade routes, marriage claims, insults, and possibly one stolen hunting falcon. Wars had begun for worse reasons, but not many. "That war redrew half the region," Aldrin said, "and erased us." "How?" "By agreement." He frowned. Merith turned toward the window. Lethrain stood on the road between armies. Both sides wanted passage. Both promised protection. Both lied beautifully, as rulers often do, like minstrels with sharper hats. Aldrin smiled despite himself. Merith's voice softened. "Our last king, Edrian, understood that joining either side would destroy the valley. Refusing both would do the same. So he chose a third answer. He disappeared. He made us disappear." She explained that King Edrian sent envoys to all warring courts, offering something more valuable than soldiers. Silence. Lethrain would provide no troops, no coin, no public alliance, and no official road. In return, every claimant agreed to remove the kingdom from maps, tax ledgers, royal claims, and border records. Its mountain passes would be marked unsafe. Its roads would be abandoned. Its name would be omitted. A kingdom hidden not by magic, but by paperwork. Aldrin nearly laughed. It was absurd. It was brilliant. It was exactly the sort of thing only desperate people and clerks could achieve. Medieval records, he knew, were powerful things. A village misplaced in a tax roll could vanish from official concern for years, and a lord omitted from a charter might spend half his life proving he existed. Ink could wound as surely as steel, though it usually required better lighting. "So everyone agreed?" he asked. "Not happily, but war makes men practical. Our valley became more useful as a forgotten corridor than as a battlefield." "And afterward?" "Afterward, those kingdoms had new borders, new grudges, and very little desire to admit they had all conspired to erase a neighbor. So Lethrain remained erased." "Yes." They returned toward the Hall of Portraits. Aldrin stopped before the final painting. A man in a plain crown stood beside a woman, holding a book. His face was tired, but kind. "King Edrian?" Marith bowed her head. "He saved us." "What happened to him?" "He walked the western road after the agreement was sealed." "To where?" "No one knows." Aldrin felt the air shift. "He never returned." "No." The empty throne seemed heavier now, not abandoned, reserved. Marith led him back into the great hall. "Our kings ended with Edrian. He left no command to crown another, only instructions." "What instructions?" "That Lethrain should be kept, not ruled." Aldrin looked around at the servants, guards, polished stones, tended banners, and waiting throne. "And you are the keeper." "One of many. Custodians are chosen by council, not blood. We preserve the laws, the roads, the songs, the fields, the names." "The names?" Marith's expression grew very still. "Every person born here is written in the book of remaining. Every person who dies is spoken aloud at winter's end. Every child learns the names of the last outsiders who knew us kindly." "Why?" "So forgetting never becomes easy." Outside, bells began to ring softly. Not warning bells. Evening bells. The sound moved over the castle and down into the valley, like warm water poured slowly into a basin. Aldrin thought of his maps, folded in his pack, each one missing this valley. He thought of the marker stones with crowns, but no words. He thought of King Edrian walking alone into a world that had agreed not to remember him. At last, he understood the silence surrounding Lethrain. It was not emptiness. It was an oath still being kept. Marith allowed Aldrin one night of rest before showing him the castle properly, which was wise, because mysteries are much easier to appreciate after warm soup, clean blankets, and not being stared at by an entire valley, as though you might start shedding prophecies. He slept in a guest chamber overlooking the eastern gardens. The bed was narrow but soft. The blankets smelled faintly of lavender. Somewhere beyond the window, rain whispered over leaves. For the first time in many weeks, Aldrin woke without road dust in his teeth, which felt like a luxury usually reserved for bishops and cats. At dawn, a young servant brought him oatcakes, honey, and a cup of steaming herbal tea. "Custodian Marith will meet you in the West Gallery," she said. "Thank you." The servant glanced at his boots. "Your mule has been given carrots." I hope he received them with humility. He did not. That sounds correct. When Aldrin met Marith, she carried a ring of keys, large enough to suggest either authority or a serious inability to throw anything away. "The castle has waited a long time for new footsteps," she said. "It looks well cared for." It is. Waiting is not the same as neglect. They began in the West Gallery, where tall windows spilled cool morning light across polished stone floors. Tapestries lined the walls, their colors softened but still rich. Hunts beneath red moons, ships crossing green seas, harvest dances, a crowned woman planting a sapling. Aldrin paused before one faded tapestry showing a white stag drinking from a black pool. "That one appears older." "Older than the agreement," Marith said. "It tells the tale of Saint Elian, who supposedly followed a stag for 3 days and discovered a spring that cured toothaches. Did it? No idea. But for 2 centuries, people left teeth there in little clay bowls. Aldrin turned slowly. Teeth. Yes. That is upsettingly specific. People are often upsettingly specific when they believe pain may stop. There it was, the day's strange little truth, tucked between silk threads and saintly deer. In some medieval shrines, folk did leave wax limbs, crutches, pins, locks of hair, and occasionally teeth as offerings, hoping the saint would notice the complaint more clearly. Apparently, even heaven appreciated helpful labels. They continued into the royal apartments. Every room had been kept clean. The bedchambers were aired, the writing desks dusted, the wardrobes held folded garments wrapped in linen. Yet no one lived there. The rooms felt less like abandoned spaces and more like breaths being held. Aldrin touched the edge of a carved chair. Does anyone use these chambers? No. Never? Only to clean, repair, and remember. That sounds lonely. Meredith considered it. Perhaps, but not all empty places are lonely. Some are simply respected. They entered the Queen's Solar, a bright chamber with painted shutters and shelves filled with small objects, embroidery hoops, ivory combs, carved game pieces, a cracked mirror, a pair of child-sized shoes. Aldrin lingered over the shoes. They belonged to Prince Cale, Meredith said. Adrian's son? Yes. What happened to him? He died of fever before his 9th year. The room quieted around the words. No dramatic thunder, no sudden wind, just a small sorrow, perfectly preserved. Aldrin lowered his hand. I'm sorry. So were they. Meredith's voice remained gentle, not theatrical. That made it worse somehow. From there they passed into the council tower, where narrow stairs climbed in careful spirals. Aldrin counted the steps at first, then gave up around 80 because nothing improves a long staircase quite like realizing you have volunteered to climb it. At the top stood a circular chamber with windows facing every direction. Maps covered the walls. Old maps. Beautiful maps. Lethrain appeared at the center of each, drawn with rivers, villages, orchards, chapels, mills, roads, and watchtowers. Beyond its borders, the neighboring kingdoms were sketched vaguely, almost politely ignored. Aldrin stepped closer. His breath caught. Some of the maps were astonishingly accurate, more accurate than many he had seen in noble libraries. You had royal cartographers, he murmured. 3 generations of them. What happened after the erasure? They stopped drawing outward. He understood. The maps became smaller with time. The earliest showed distant cities, mountain passes, trade roads, foreign ports. Later ones showed only the valley, then only the villages, then fields, then irrigation lines, then orchards. The world had not vanished all at once. It had narrowed, carefully, peacefully, terribly. Were they ordered to stop? Aldrin asked. No. They were asked not to endanger anyone. And danger began at the edge of the page. Yes. He studied the final map, created perhaps 20 years earlier. It was exquisite. Every cottage marked, every footbridge named, every spring and shrine recorded. But beyond the surrounding forest lay blank parchment. Not ignorance, choice. Your people know very little of the outside. They know enough. Do they? Meredith did not answer at once. Outside, clouds moved across the sun, dimming the room. That is one reason I wished to speak with you. Aldrin turned, but she had already moved toward another door. Not yet, she said. First, the throne room. They descended another stair, crossed a chapel where candles burned before names instead of saints, and entered the great hall from a side passage. Morning light now fell directly upon the empty throne. It was simpler than Aldrin had first realized. Oak beneath the polish, carved arms, a back shaped with interlacing branches. No gold, no jewels, only a crown symbol at its crest. A small cushion rested upon the seat.
Newly brushed. "Every week," Marith said, "someone cleans it." "Who?" "Everyone, eventually." "The entire kingdom?" "One household at a time. It is considered an honor." Aldrin imagined farmers, bakers, shepherds, millers, children, elders, all climbing to this hall to clean a throne. No one used. You preserve it for a king who never returned. For a promise. What promise? Marith approached the throne but did not touch it. Adrian said that power should never sit comfortably again unless all people remembered what it cost. That was a sentence with deep roots. Aldrin felt them. In most courts he had visited, thrones were made to impress visitors, intimidate petitioners, and make rulers appear taller than nature had generously provided. Here, the throne seemed designed to keep absence visible, which was inconvenient for anyone hoping to feel important. Aldrin approved. At midday, Marith led him through the kitchens, which were far livelier. Cooks stirred great pots, apprentices kneaded dough, and one red-faced boy chased a chicken that seemed personally committed to freedom. The bird dodged beneath a table. The boy followed. A cook sighed without looking up. "That chicken has escaped 4 times. Perhaps it seeks political representation," Aldrin said. The cook snorted. "Then it can start by laying eggs on time." Even Marith smiled. Beyond the kitchens lay storage rooms, laundries, armories, granaries, and cellars. The armory surprised Aldrin most. Weapons hung polished but unused. Spears, shields, bows, helmets, and swords remained in perfect order. "No soldiers?" he asked. "Guards, hunters, militia drills twice each season." "Against whom?" "Fear." That answer stayed with him. At last, as afternoon mellowed toward evening, they reached a locked chamber beneath the north tower. Marith selected a key. "This room is opened only to custodians." "Then why show me?" "Because you crossed the road." The door opened. Inside stood shelves filled with sealed boxes. Each box bore a date. Marith lifted one gently and opened it. Within lay scraps of parchment, broken seals, fragments of old letters, and small objects wrapped in cloth. "This is the memory vault," she said. Aldrin leaned closer. "What do you keep here?" "Proof that we existed." The room seemed suddenly colder. She showed him a coin minted under King Adrian, a treaty seal cracked in half, a child's wooden horse, a strip of royal banner, a page torn from an outside chronicle where Lethrain's name had been scraped away. Aldrin stared at the scarred parchment. The blank space was more powerful than writing. Someone had removed a kingdom with a knife. Marith closed the box. "We do not show this to children too soon." "Why?" "Because anger is easier to teach than wisdom." Outside, evening bells began again. Their sound reached even that hidden chamber beneath stone. Aldrin looked at the shelves, the boxes. The patient evidence of a place history had agreed to misplace. The castle was not merely waiting for rulers. It was guarding memory from decay. And now, whether he wished it or not, Aldrin had become part of what it guarded. By the next morning, Aldrin understood that Lethrain's castle did not sleep so much as lower its voice. Before dawn, footsteps moved softly through corridors. Doors opened with practiced care. Hearths breathed themselves awake. Somewhere in the courtyard, a rooster announced the sun, with all the humility of a herald who had personally invented morning. Aldrin dressed, found his satchel, and followed the scent of bread toward the kitchens. He discovered Mareth already there, eating porridge beside a window while reviewing a stack of small wooden tablets. "Do custodians ever rest?" he asked. "When people stop needing things written down." "So never." "Exactly." She slid one tablet aside. "Today you should walk among the people." "I did yesterday." "You met them. That is different." Aldrin could not argue with that. Meeting people was easy. Understanding them required slower feet. A young woman named Tessa was assigned to guide him through the valley. She was a weaver's daughter, though Aldrin soon learned that in Lethrain, most people were several things at once. Tessa wove cloth, kept bees, copied festival songs, and knew how to set a broken finger. "Is that common?" Aldrin asked. "What?" "Knowing 4 lives' worth of work," she shrugged. "There are not enough of us to be useless." That was a sentence worthy of carving over a schoolhouse door. They began in the lower village where morning work had already filled the lanes with gentle noise. Hammers tapped, wheels creaked, goats complained with the passion of unpaid actors. Children carried water in small pails, spilling enough to make their labor symbolic but cheerful. No one seemed idle, yet no one seemed hurried either. That, Aldrin decided, was the strangest thing of all. Outside the blacksmith's forge, a broad-shouldered woman shaped iron hinges while her husband pumped the bellows. Their eldest son sat nearby, mending a boot. "You are the outside man," the smith said. "I am Aldrin." "I am Mara." She struck the iron. Sparks leapt. "Do people outside still shoe horses badly?" "Frequently. Comforting. Some traditions endure." Mara showed him plowshares, nails, cooking hooks, pruning knives, and delicate clasps for festival cloaks. The forge served half the valley, and every tool carried small marks, showing which family had made or repaired it. "We do not waste metal," she said. "Iron remembers work." Aldrin liked that. Tessa led him onward to the mill, where flour dust softened every surface. The miller was a thin old man named Oric, who sneezed repeatedly and insisted this proved the grain was excellent. "Bad flour sits quiet," he explained. "Does it?" "No idea, but I have said it for 40 years. Near the mill, women washed linen in cold stream water, laughing as they worked. One asked Aldrin whether outside, nobles still wore sleeves long enough to drag in soup. "Yes. Tragic. Deeply. Do they know?" "I fear not." That pleased them very much. The day unfolded by task and conversation. Aldrin met shepherds who could name every sheep by face, which seemed impressive until one sheep stared at him, and he realized the animal had the judgmental expression of a retired magistrate. He met potters who mixed local clay with ground shell because an ancestor had discovered it made vessels stronger. He met gardeners who planted bitter herbs at field edges to discourage rabbits, insects, and apparently certain relatives. At midday, Tessa brought him to a long communal shed where elders taught children, not letters alone, everything. A gray-haired man recited multiplication through grain measures. A woman explained healing herbs. A former guard demonstrated how to read tracks in mud. 3 children practiced writing names from the book of remaining onto wax tablets. Each name was spoken aloud before being written. Aldrin watched a little girl carefully form the letters of someone dead 200 years. "Do they memorize them all?" he asked. "Not all," Tessa said. "Enough to understand they are not first." That quiet answer sat with him. Outside, kingdoms taught children who ruled, who conquered, who inherited, who rebelled. Lethrain taught children who remained. A curious custom appeared during the afternoon meal. Before eating, each family placed a small, empty bowl at the table's edge. Aldrin assumed it symbolized ancestors, saints, or absent kin. Tessa corrected him. It is for the guest who has not yet arrived. But guests almost never arrive. That is why the bowl must remain. In some old households beyond Lethrain, Aldrin knew, an empty place might be kept for holy visitors, wandering poor, or spirits of the beloved dead. Here the habit had become something else, a discipline of welcome, a way of refusing to let isolation turn mean. The meal itself was simple and excellent. Barley stew, dark bread, goat cheese, roasted onions, and pears stewed with honey. Aldrin ate enough to make walking afterward an act of courage. Brim, meanwhile, received oats from 3 separate children and immediately concluded Lethrain was the finest civilization yet produced. In the afternoon, Tessa took Aldrin beyond the village to smaller farms scattered near the valley's edge. Families lived there in stone houses roofed with slate. Each kept signal horns near their doors, not for invasion, Tessa explained, but for fire, flood, sickness, and births. Births? If a child comes early, people should hurry. With blankets, hot water, broth, gossip, advice nobody requested. Ah, the full army. Exactly. At one farm, Aldrin met a man named Pell, who had been born lame in one leg and served as beekeeper, record keeper, and unofficial judge of pie disputes. Pie disputes? Aldrin asked. More serious than land disputes, Pell said gravely. Land waits. Pie grows cold. Pell spoke openly about the valley's choice to remain hidden. My great-grandmother said the outside world was not evil, just loud. And you believe that? I believe she was kind enough to say loud. Aldrin smiled. Do you never wonder what lies beyond? Pell looked toward the forested ridge. Of course. But you stay. Yes. Why? The beekeeper watched his hives, where bees moved like living gold. Because wondering is not the same as leaving. That answer, too, felt rooted deep. As evening approached, Tessa led Aldrin to a hillside above the village. From there, he could see almost all of Lethrain. Castle, mill, fields, orchards, roads, roofs, river, grazing sheep, and smoke rising into lavender sky. Bells rang. The valley paused. The noon remembering had passed hours ago, but this was different. Evening gratitude, Tessa said, not required, just practiced. People stood in doorways, fields, lanes, and yards. Some bowed their heads, some held hands, some simply looked around. No priest commanded them, no noble watched. They remembered because remembering was how they stayed whole. Aldrin thought of all the places outside where people lived crowded together and still forgot one another completely. Here, hidden from history, every life seemed witnessed, not perfectly. No place was perfect. Someone somewhere was certainly annoyed about cheese, inheritance, or a neighbor's rooster. Humanity had standards to maintain, but Lethrain had endured, not because it locked itself away from love. It endured because those who stayed had made staying into an art. As the last bell faded, Tessa turned to him. You will be asked whether we should remain as we are. Aldrin looked at her sharply. By whom? Everyone. Eventually. I have no right to answer. No, she said gently. But you came from the road. That means your silence would also answer. Below them, lamps appeared one by one in cottage windows. The forgotten kingdom glowed softly against the coming dark, alive with people who had chosen, generation after generation, not to vanish from themselves. And Aldrin, who had spent his life drawing borders around places, wondered for the first time whether a place was not truly made by boarders at all. Perhaps it was made by those who stayed. The next day began with ribbons, not the delicate sort nobles tied around gifts, nor the dramatic kind knights wore into tournaments, so everyone could pretend romance was not mostly an excuse for expensive horse accidents. These ribbons were everywhere. Blue strips fluttered from doorways. Green bands hung from orchard branches. White threads had been tied around fence posts, wells, cart handles, and even the horns of one extremely patient goat. Aldrin stepped from the guest house, blinked at the colorful village, and found Tessa waiting beside the road with a basket over one arm. Should I ask? You should. Will the answer make sense? Eventually. That is not comforting. It is a festival day. Then sense has politely left the building. Tessa smiled and handed him a blue ribbon. For your wrist. Aldrin accepted it carefully. What does it mean? That you were welcomed. And the green? That something is growing. The white? That something was remembered. He glanced at the goat, which wore all three and looked deeply burdened by symbolism. And him? That is Barley. He eats laundry. Of course he does. They walked toward the village square, where people had gathered in quiet excitement. Children carried bundles of herbs. Elders sat beneath awnings. Musicians tuned flutes, fiddles, and small drums. The fountain's stone figures had been decorated with garlands, making the carved farmers and weavers look as though they had unexpectedly been invited to a cheerful wedding. This is the Day of Echoes, Tessa said. A memorial, a celebration. For whom? For those who taught us what must not be lost. That sounded like a memorial wearing brighter shoes. The morning ritual began with no priest, no royal herald, and no trumpet blast. Instead, a little girl climbed onto the fountain's edge and recited the first line of an old planting song. Her voice trembled. Then an old man answered with the second line. A baker gave the third. A shepherd gave the fourth. Soon, the entire square joined in, not loudly, but warmly, as though the song had been sleeping in every chest and had simply been invited out. Aldrin did not know the words, but the melody curled around him like wood smoke. It was not polished music. It wandered. It repeated. It lingered too long over certain notes, like someone telling a story who enjoyed the good parts and refused to hurry. After the song came the strange part. Everyone began trading mistakes, actual mistakes, publicly. A potter stood and announced that 3 winters earlier, he had fired 20 bowls too hot and turned them into what he called useful disappointments. People applauded. A shepherd admitted she once mistook a neighbor's sheep for her own for nearly half a day, despite the fact that the sheep had a bell with someone else's name carved into it. More applause. Mara the blacksmith confessed that, as a girl, she had tried to sharpen a spoon because she believed soup should be challenged. That earned tremendous laughter. Aldrin leaned toward Tessa. Why are they confessing harmless failures? So children learn shame can be survived. That silenced him. It was odd, funny, wise, and slightly dangerous, because Aldrin had enough mistakes to occupy the square until harvest. The custom continued for nearly an hour. No one mocked cruelly. No one used another person's confession as a weapon. Each mistake became a little lantern set down in public, glowing briefly before being accepted into the village's larger memory. A curious practice, Aldrin thought. In some medieval guilds, apprentices learned by copying a master's work, but also by studying flawed pieces kept in workshops as warnings. A crooked horseshoe, a cracked pot, a badly cut beam. These could teach better than perfect examples. Lethrain had turned the whole village into such a workshop, except with more honey cakes. And yes, there were honey cakes. By mid-morning, tables filled the square. Flat cakes fried in butter, pears baked with cinnamon, cheese wrapped in leaves, roasted chestnuts, stewed beans, small cups of spiced milk. Aldrin tried everything because he believed in cultural respect, and also because he had no self-control around baked pears. Brim attempted to eat a ribbon. Barley the goat watched with professional interest. After the meal came the procession of little things. Children carried ordinary objects through the village. A wooden spoon, a broken spindle, a cracked cup, a dull knife, a patched boot, a candle stub, a tiny toy horse missing one wheel. Each object had a story, not grand stories, no dragons, no kings, no battles. A spoon that belonged to the woman who fed 50 people during a flood. A spindle used by a blind grandmother who could still tell wool quality by touch. A cup cracked during the winter when every household shared grain. A boot worn by the boy who ran between farms, warning of fever. A candle stub from the night a lost child was found. Aldrin realized that Lethrain preserved history at the size of a hand. Outside, chronicles praised crowned heads and armies. Here, a patched boot could receive more reverence than a sword. Honestly, the boot had probably done less damage. In the afternoon, the villagers gathered in the orchard for another ritual. This one involved listening. Each elder sat beneath a tree. The younger folk moved from one to another, sitting quietly while stories were told. No writing, no interruption, no correction unless the teller invited it. Tessa led Aldrin to an old woman named Sira, whose eyes were cloudy, but whose voice remained sharp as a needle. She told of a winter when wolves came down from the ridge, and the villagers placed bells on ropes between cottages so people could move safely through snow. She told of a custodian who forgot the noon remembering and fined herself 2 loaves of bread. She told of a boy who tried to sail across the mill pond in a kneading trough and discovered that courage and buoyancy were separate gifts. Aldrin laughed softly. Sira smiled. "Write that down, mapmaker. The trough, the lesson." So he did. As dusk approached, the final ceremony began. Everyone walked to the old boundary field near the western road. There, half hidden in grass, stood a row of stone markers carved with the crown of Lethrain. No words, no names, only the symbol. The villagers carried candles in clay cups. One by one, they placed them before the stones. Then they spoke names, not all at once, one person at a time. King Edrian, Queen Meryl, Prince Cale, the envoys, the road keepers, the last merchant, the last pilgrim, the last messenger, people whose lives had become thin threads, holding the kingdom to the world beyond. When Aldrin's turn came, he expected to remain silent, but Marith, standing nearby, nodded gently, so he spoke the only name he could. Aldrin. The villagers did not laugh. They did not cheer. They simply accepted the name into the quiet. For the first time since arriving, he understood why their rituals mattered. Lethrain had not survived by hiding alone. It had survived by repeating, carefully and stubbornly, that what was unseen still counted. The candles burned low. The forest beyond the stones darkened. Somewhere past that darkness lay the outside world, loud and hungry and forgetful. Behind Aldrin stood a people who had turned memory into bread, song, laughter, ribbon, mistake, and flame. And as night settled gently over the valley, he felt the forgotten kingdom echo inside him, soft but unmistakable, like a bell heard through dreams. The morning after the Day of Echoes, Aldrin woke with the strange heaviness that follows too much food, too many songs, and one emotional candlelit ceremony that sneaks up on a man like a polite thief. The valley seemed quieter now, not sad, just softened. Ribbons still fluttered from fence posts and branches, though some had already tangled themselves into little knots, because even symbols must eventually deal with weather. Marith sent for him after breakfast. This time, she did not meet him in the hall or the courtyard. She waited beneath an archway on the northern side of the castle, holding a lantern, though sunlight already filled the morning. "Bring your satchel," she said. Aldrin lifted it. "And your patience. That is less conveniently packed. You will manage." They passed through a narrow door behind the chapel and descended a short stair into a corridor lined with cool stone. The air smelled of wax, dust, and old leather, a scent so beloved by scholars that some would probably marry it if church law allowed. At the corridor's end stood two oak doors bound in iron. Marith unlocked them slowly. "This is the Library of Remaining." Inside, Aldrin stopped breathing for a moment. Shelves climbed from floor to ceiling. Ladders rested on rails. Tables stood beneath tall windows. Bundles of scrolls filled carved chests. Books lay chained to reading desks, not because Lethrain distrusted readers, Marith explained, but because books had a talent for wandering off with people who claimed they were only borrowing them. Aldrin understood completely. He had borrowed a grammar once for 6 years. The library was not grand in the way royal libraries tried to be grand. There were no gilded ceilings or marble statues pretending to understand philosophy. It felt practical, intimate, alive. The books had been mended, copied, repaired, touched. "These are your chronicles?" Aldrin asked. "Our memory," Marith said, "the part too heavy for song." She led him to a long table where several volumes had already been placed. Their covers were plain, each marked with dates. A scribe sat nearby, sharpening a quill. He was thin, solemn, and wore ink stains on both hands like devotional marks. "This is Brother Calvin," Marith said. "I am not a monk," he added immediately. "Then why brother?" "My parents had expectations." Aldrin liked him at once. Calvin opened the first volume. "This begins before the erasure." The pages were filled with careful script, lists of harvests, births, marriages, storms, border disputes, repairs to bridges, and notes on the health of cattle. History, Aldrin thought, was mostly made of things no bard wanted to sing about until they went wrong. Then the entries changed. The handwriting remained steady, but the words grew tighter. Messengers arrived from the east, soldiers seen beyond the pass, envoys delayed, grain hidden. Children moved from outer farms. Aldrin leaned closer. King Edrian's council had debated for 7 nights. Some wanted alliance, some wanted surrender, some wanted resistance, which sounded noble until one counted the spears and found optimism had done most of the arithmetic. Marith turned a page. Here the ink darkened. "The agreement," she said. Aldrin read in silence. Lethrain's envoys had carried 3 sealed offers, each written differently for each neighboring crown. To the north, Lethrain promised silence. To the south, it promised no road for northern armies. To the east, it promised no road for southern armies. Every kingdom believed it had gained a private advantage. "That is dishonest?" Marith asked. "Clever?" "Both," Calvin nodded. "Our old teachers call it the lie that spared the harvest." Aldrin absorbed that. The next pages described the practical work of disappearance. Road signs removed, border stones altered, maps recalled, travel discouraged, trade redirected, royal marriages left unrecorded outside the valley, old debts quietly forgiven, so no foreign court would have reason to send collectors. That last detail impressed Aldrin deeply. Debt collectors could find a man in a blizzard, behind a locked door, while disguised as a bush. Lethrain had escaped them. A miracle indeed. One entry described monks from a neighboring abbey, scraping Lethrain's name from a regional chronicle. Another recorded payments made to cartographers to copy blank hills where villages stood. A third noted that children born after the agreement were not to be spoken of beyond the boundary. Aldrin looked up. That must have hurt. Marith's face was unreadable. Yes. The deeper secret, however, waited in a smaller book wrapped in blue cloth. Marith untied it herself. This was Adrian's private record. The handwriting inside was less formal, more human. Some lines sloped downward, as though written by candlelight after exhaustion had pulled at the king's wrist. Aldrin read only what Marith allowed. Adrian had not trusted the agreement to last. He believed one of the neighboring kingdoms would eventually break it and march through the valley anyway. So he made another arrangement, one known only to a few. He gave himself. Aldrin looked at Marith. What does that mean? He left as hostage witness and distraction. The king had walked the western road not in exile, not in defeat, but as part of the bargain. As long as he remained beyond Lethrain, appearing occasionally in foreign courts under another name, rumors would suggest that the royal line had scattered, the valley emptied, the kingdom weakened beyond value. He became proof of our ending, Marith said. Aldrin felt cold despite the warm light. And no one knew? A few custodians, not the people, not at first. Did he write back? Calvin opened a narrow drawer and removed 3 letters. Only 3. Each had been copied many times to preserve the fading original. The first said the road was watched. The second said the treaties held. The third contained only a blessing for the valley and a request that no one search for him. After that, nothing. A silence measured in generations. Aldrin rested his fingertips near the page, but did not touch it. There was the sacrifice hidden beneath every ribbon, every song, every polished throne, not merely a king who vanished. A man who allowed his people to believe he might return because hope was safer than grief. A strange marginal note caught Aldrin's eye beside one passage. It described how during the first hidden winter, the castle cats were listed among essential stores because they protected grain from mice. Each cat had a name, ration, and temperament. One was recorded simply as unhelpful but decorative. Even in catastrophe, someone had taken the time to insult a cat in official ink. Aldrin laughed softly despite himself. Marith smiled. We keep that note for morale. Wise. He spent the rest of the day reading under supervision. He learned that Lethrain had nearly revealed itself 3 times. During a plague scare, after a landslide, and when a lovesick shepherd tried to follow a wandering peddler beyond the forest. What happened to him? Aldrin asked. He returned after 2 days, hungry, embarrassed, and married 8 months later to someone entirely local. Recovery comes in many forms. By evening, the library windows glowed amber. Calvin closed the last volume. Aldrin sat very still. The Forgotten Kingdom had not been forgotten by accident. It had been edited out of the world with knives, ink, bargains, fear, courage, and a king's lonely footsteps. Marith watched him across the table. You see now why your maps matter. Aldrin nodded slowly. A map could reveal. A map could protect. A map could betray. For the first time in his life, the blank space beyond a border seemed not like ignorance, but responsibility. Outside, the evening bells began. Their sound entered the library gently, touching every closed book, every copied name, every secret kept from ruin. Aldrin folded his hands over his satchel and understood that before he ever drew Lethrain, he would have to decide whether the world deserved to find it. By dawn, Aldrin had learned something important about secrets. They were much heavier after reading. Before the library, Lethrain had seemed like a marvel hidden by mist, old roads, and stubborn silence. After the library, it felt like a lantern cupped carefully against wind. Beautiful, yes, but also fragile. Marith seemed to understand this without asking. After breakfast, she sent him not to the council chamber, nor the vault, nor another shelf of alarming documents. She sent him into the forest. "Today," she said, fastening her cloak beneath her chin, "you should see what kept us hidden when ink alone would not." Aldrin glanced toward the dark line of trees beyond the western fields. The road? The road is only what people notice. And the forest is what they don't? The forest is what notices them first. That was not especially reassuring. They set out with Tessa and an old woodsman named Garrick, who carried a bow, a hatchet, and the expression of a man who considered conversation an optional seasoning. Brim came too, because Brim had discovered that castle stables included apples and therefore considered himself nobility. The path climbed from the valley floor into thick woodland. Almost immediately, the air changed. The warmth of the fields softened into cool shade. Ferns brushed Aldrin's boots. Moss covered stones in thick green blankets. High branches filtered sunlight into shifting pieces. And the forest smelled of damp bark, mushrooms, and leaves quietly becoming soil. Garrick walked ahead without sound. Aldrin followed with considerably more cracking of twigs, slipping on roots, and private negotiations with gravity. Tessa looked amused. "Outside, paths are easier?" "Outside paths have the decency to warn you before attacking." That root was visible. It looked innocent. They usually do. After a while, the road disappeared, not ended. Disappeared. One moment Aldrin could still sense the faint line of old paving beneath weeds. The next, the forest swallowed all order. Trees clustered strangely. Brambles curved across open ground. Fallen trunks lay in places that forced travelers to turn aside again and again. Garrick stopped beside a mound of stones covered in moss. "Old marker." Aldrin knelt. Beneath the moss he found the crown symbol, nearly gone. "No words," he said. "No need," Garrick replied. Marith touched the stone. When the erasure began, Lethrain did not destroy every road. That would have drawn attention. Instead, the forest was encouraged to confuse them. Encouraged? Garrick gave the smallest smile. Trees can be persuaded. He showed Aldrin how saplings had once been planted in staggered lines to break sight. Thorn hedges had been guided across unused paths. Drainage channels had been altered so certain trails became muddy every spring. Stones had been shifted, not enough to look deliberate, but enough to make wheels difficult. It was patient work, generations of it, a kingdom hidden by gardeners with very long plans. Aldrin found that oddly delightful. Most rulers built walls because walls made them feel impressive. Lethrain had built inconvenience. And honestly, inconvenience had defeated more armies than pride ever admitted. They continued deeper. Birdsong faded, then returned in different notes. A stream crossed their way, clear and narrow. Garrick stepped across on stones that looked random until Aldrin noticed each one had been placed just so. Easy for those who knew, awkward for those who did not. A curious truth occurred to him.
In many medieval forests, paths were not fixed lines like ink on parchment. They shifted with grazing, timber cutting, storms, and memory. A route known to locals could vanish completely to strangers within a season if no one maintained it. Maps hated that. Forests, apparently, found it hilarious. They reached a steep ridge before midday. From below, it had looked like a simple wooded rise. From the top, Aldrin saw the trick. The valley of Lethrain sat in a natural bowl, guarded by ridges, wetlands, and folded hills. Smoke from villages dispersed beneath higher winds. Roads curved through hollows, invisible from distant passes. Streams ran outward through narrow ravines unsuitable for carts. No army could move easily through this, Aldrin said. No, Marith replied, but scouts could. Scouts did. Garrick pointed toward a cluster of ancient yews. First blind. Aldrin frowned. Blind? Watch blind. They climbed to it. Hidden among roots and branches was a small shelter roofed with bark and soil. From inside, one could see the western approach while remaining almost invisible. There are more? Aldrin asked. 12, said Garrick. Still used? Yes. The woodsman said nothing more, which somehow answered every remaining question. Lethrain had not survived through innocence. It had watched, quietly, constantly. From the ridge they descended toward wetlands. Reeds whispered around shallow pools. Dragonflies flashed blue and green. The ground looked firm in places where it was not, and uncertain where it could safely hold weight. Garrick led them along a winding route marked by tiny signs Aldrin would never have seen alone. 3 stones near a willow, a branch bent at shoulder height, a patch of yellow flowers beside safe ground. Brim disliked the marsh intensely. For once, Aldrin agreed with him. Many outsiders lost their way here, he asked. Some, Garrick said. Died? Mostly cursed. Reasonable. Marith added, the marsh was more useful than a wall. A wall invites siege. A marsh invites complaints and damp socks. Aldrin laughed. The sound vanished softly among reeds. By afternoon, they reached the western boundary from the other side, near the very road Aldrin had taken into Lethrain. From here, the entrance seemed impossible to find. Trees leaned together. Ivy-masked stones. The path turned at an angle that made the valley road appear to be only a deer track. Aldrin stared. I walked through that? You were fortunate, Tessa said. Fortunate? Or very nosy? Both have served me well. Garrick crouched and brushed leaves away from a small carved stone set low beside the path. A crown. This one still had faint letters beneath it. Not the kingdom's name, only a warning. Remember before entering. Aldrin traced the words with his eyes. Why leave this? Marith answered quietly. Because secrecy, without conscience, becomes a trap. The forest around them seemed to listen. Aldrin thought of travelers turned away by mud, thorns, confusing paths, missing signs, and old fears. He thought of the charcoal burner who had warned him. Perhaps the outer villages knew fragments. Perhaps they had inherited the habit of looking aside. Not betrayal, not loyalty exactly. Something older and blurrier. A shared agreement to leave sleeping things asleep. As evening approached, Garrick led them back through a higher path. The sun sank behind branches. Long shadows folded over the moss. Somewhere an owl called once, offended by daylight's lingering presence. Aldrin walked more slowly now. He had entered Lethrain believing the kingdom was hidden from the world. Now he saw the other half. The world had also been hidden from Lethrain by ridge, marsh, thorn, habit, and fear. Protection had a shape, so did isolation.
At the forest's edge, the valley opened before them again, glowing in the last light. Fields breathed gold. The castle watched from its hill. Bells began to ring below. Aldrin looked back once. The trees had already closed around the path. Had he not known where to look, he would have seen only forest, and perhaps that was the forest's greatest trick. It did not conceal Lethrain by becoming strange. It concealed it by seeming perfectly ordinary. The morning after the forest walk, Aldrin found a boy waiting outside his chamber with a covered basket and the solemn expression of someone trusted with either state secrets or pastries, possibly both. "Custodian Marith asks you to come to the lower orchard," the boy said. "At once? When you have eaten." Aldrin lifted the cloth. Warm rolls, sliced pears, and a small pot of butter. Lethrain, he decided, handled mysterious summons better than most kingdoms. By the time he reached the orchard, mist still clung low between the trees. Dew silvered the grass. Bees moved lazily among late blossoms, and the air smelled of damp earth, apple skin, and wood smoke drifting from the village below. Marith stood beneath an old pear tree beside a young man splitting kindling. He looked perhaps 25, broad-shouldered but lean, with sleeves rolled to the elbow and hair tied back carelessly. His boots were muddy. A small scar crossed one eyebrow. Nothing about him suggested royalty, unless royalty had recently become very interested in firewood. "This is Rowan," Marith said. The young man rested his axe against the chopping block and bowed. Not deeply, not awkwardly, just enough. "You are the map maker, so I keep being told. I am told I am a prince, so we both suffer labels." Aldrin glanced at Marith. She gave nothing away. Rowan smiled faintly. "Yes, apparently that is the part where people usually stare." "To be fair," Aldrin said, "most princes I've met do not begin introductions beside kindling. Then most princes are cold." Aldrin liked him immediately, which seemed dangerous. Marith led them toward a stone bench beneath the pear tree. "Rowan is descended from King Edrian's younger sister." "Not from Edrian himself?" "No. His son died young, and no later heir was crowned. But Edrian's sister remained in Lethrain. Her line continued quietly." Rowan sat and picked a splinter from his palm. Very quietly. "How quietly?" Aldrin asked. "My grandfather cleaned stables. My mother keeps geese. I repair roofs, help with harvest, and occasionally disappoint people by not glowing with ancestral majesty." "That must be exhausting. You have no idea." Marith's expression softened. "For generations, the bloodline was recorded, but given no privilege beyond responsibility. No titles in daily use. No lands beyond family property. No command." "Why preserve it then?" Aldrin asked. Rowan looked toward the castle hill. "Because people enjoy knowing where a story went, even when they do not wish to live inside it." That answer was gentle and heavy. They walked together through the orchard as the mist lifted. Rowan explained that each tree belonged not to one family, but to a rotation of households. Fruit was gathered by need, labor shared by season, and disputes settled by the orchard ledger. "There are disputes over apples? You have clearly never met an apple person. Should I be afraid?" "Only during cider pressing." Aldrin made a mental note. Rowan showed him a row of young saplings planted after storms damaged older trees. Each bore a small carved tag with a name, not of the planter, but of someone recently dead. "This one is for my father," Rowan said, touching a slender trunk. "I'm sorry. He would have hated being a pear tree." "Why?" "He preferred plums, also attention." Aldrin laughed softly. Rowan smiled, but his eyes remained on the tree. My mother says grief grows better when given roots. A curious old belief came to Aldrin's mind. In many villages, trees planted for births, marriages, or deaths became living records, especially where parchment was scarce or priests unreliable. A tree could mark a life without needing ink, and unlike a monument, it had the decency to offer shade. They left the orchard and followed a lane toward the village. People greeted Rowan by name. No one bowed. A woman asked him to fix a latch. A child demanded to know whether princes could climb better than millers. Mara the blacksmith told him the hinges he promised were late. If that is royal treatment, Aldrin murmured, outside kings should try it. They would invade someone within a week from wounded pride, Rowan said. At the goose yard, Rowan's mother proved to be a compact woman with sharp eyes and a firmer command of geese than most generals had over soldiers. Her name was Eleanor. She offered Aldrin a cup of watered cider and looked him over. So, the outside has sent us a thin man with ink fingers. It has sent worse, Rowan said. I know. I married your father. Rowan sighed. Aldrin nearly choked on cider. Eleanor did not speak of royal blood until they walked beyond the yard to mend a section of fence. My son could claim the throne, she said calmly. Aldrin looked at Rowan. Rowan focused very hard on a fence post. Would people accept that? Some would, Eleanor replied. Most would worry first, which is sensible. Crowns are like wasp nests, interesting from a distance. And Rowan, he has sense enough to dread it, Rowan finally spoke. There has been no ruler here for generations. Why should I become one because my ancestors were professionally seated? Aldrin admired the phrase. Marith, who had listened in silence, answered softly, because change may come, whether we invite it or not. The words settled over them. Aldrin understood then why he had been brought here. Not merely to meet a descendant, to see a possible future. If Lethrain revealed itself, the outside world would expect a king, a treaty, a border, a signature. Outsiders understood crowns better than councils. They preferred one neck to hang responsibility upon. Rowan knew it too. I am useful as I am, he said. A man can mend roofs honestly. A prince must smile while others argue over what his smile meant. That is painfully accurate, Aldrin said. The day passed with Rowan showing him ordinary work. They repaired fencing, delivered apples to the bakery, checked a roof beam, and helped move sacks of grain into storage. Everywhere Rowan went, people treated him with affection, teasing, and the kind of trust earned by showing up with tools, not reverence, trust. By sunset, they climbed a small rise overlooking the castle. The empty throne waited somewhere inside. Rowan stood beside Aldrin with his hands rough from labor. Do they have forgotten kingdoms outside? He asked. Many places are forgotten. But not like this. No, not like this. Rowan nodded. I used to dream of leaving. When I was younger, I imagined roads full of bright banners, cities full of towers, markets with spices, ships, singers, strange coins. They exist. I know. You could still go. Rowan smiled without joy. And become what? A curiosity? A claimant? A tool for some lord who wants this valley? Blood is useful to ambitious men. They pour it into documents and call it legitimacy. Aldrin had no answer. Below, the evening bells began. Rowan bowed his head with the valley. When the last sound faded, he said, I do not want a crown, but I do want Lethrain to choose with open eyes. Aldrin looked at him then and saw the royal bloodline clearly. Not in posture, not in command, in refusal. Edrian had refused war. Rowan refused vanity. Perhaps that was what inheritance truly meant when stripped of jewels and songs, not power passing down, but a burden offered again, asking each generation what sort of person it intended to be. The feast began before anyone called it a feast. That was how Aldrin noticed Lethrain preferred to do important things. They did not announce greatness with trumpets and banners, and 17 men arguing about seating. They simply started working, and by the time anyone looked around, the whole valley had somehow become part of it. At dawn, smoke rose from ovens across the village. By mid-morning, long tables had appeared in the square. By noon, musicians were arguing over tempo. Children were stealing roasted chestnuts with the stealth of tiny bandits, and 3 elderly women were supervising soup in a manner that suggested kingdoms had fallen for less serious mistakes. "This happens every year?" Aldrin asked Tessa. "Every autumn. For harvest? For history." "That sounds heavier than harvest. It has better pudding." The Feast of Invisible History, as Calvin called it, was not written on any outside calendar. No pilgrims came, no merchants sold ribbons, no nobles arrived wearing velvet and expressions of magnificent inconvenience. It belonged only to Lethrain, and now, strangely, to Aldrin. The first course was served in wooden bowls, a thick stew of barley, carrots, onions, herbs, and lamb, rich enough to persuade even gloomy people that life still had arguments in its favor. Bread came warm, with crusts dark from the oven. Cheese was passed in wheels. Apples were sliced and sprinkled with crushed nuts. Brim received a garland. He ate half of it. Barley the goat attempted to eat the other half from Brim's neck, which nearly caused the valley's first diplomatic crisis between livestock. Rowan intervened with dignity, mostly. Then the songs began, not polished court songs about flawless ladies and knights who apparently never needed to sneeze inside helmets. These songs belonged to workers. Their rhythms matched grinding stones, scythes, spinning wheels, and footsteps on hill paths. One song told of the miller who slept through a flood and woke floating gently across his own yard on a door. Another praised a woman who hid seed grain during the War of 3 Crowns by storing it in barrels labeled spoiled turnips, because even soldiers had limits. Aldrin laughed until his sides hurt. "That actually happened?" he asked. Marith, seated beside him, nodded. "The turnip barrels were never searched. King Audrin would have approved. Only of the strategy, not the turnips." Between courses, children performed short scenes from old village tales. One wore a paper crown and played King Edrian with such solemn intensity that his oversized cloak kept slipping over his face. Another child portrayed the 3 neighboring kings, changing hats rapidly and insulting himself from different angles. The crowd adored it. Aldrin had seen court plays with silk costumes and trained actors that contained less truth than this child shouting, "I demand passage," then swapping hats and answering, "So do I, but with better handwriting." After roasted fowl, honeyed roots, and bowls of spiced lentils, the elders brought out the oldest dishes. These were not merely food. They were edible records. A flat cake made from chestnut flour recalled the winter when wheat failed. A sour plum sauce remembered the year bees vanished and honey became too precious for common use. A thin herb broth honored plague seasons when rich meals were avoided because the sick could not share them. At first, Aldrin found this strange, then moving, then brilliant. History placed upon the tongue could not remain distant. A person might ignore a date, but not bitterness, sweetness, hunger, salt. A curious old fact came to him as he tasted the chestnut cake. In many medieval households, Feast foods marked memory more strongly than books did. Certain breads belonged to saints' days, certain pies to harvest, certain fasting, meals to sorrow. A recipe could become a calendar you ate with both hands, which was frankly the finest possible use of scholarship. As evening deepened, lanterns were lit. The square glowed gold. Musicians shifted into dancing tunes, and the younger folk pulled one another into circles. Rowan was dragged in by 3 children and obeyed with the weary grace of a man accustomed to public humiliation. Mara the blacksmith danced with such force that 2 fiddlers sped up out of fear. Tessa offered Aldrin her hand. "I should warn you," he said. "I map roads, not feet." "Good. Then you understand direction." "I understand losing it." "Even better." The dance was simple enough in theory. Step, turn, clap, pass, return. In practice, Aldrin collided gently with a baker, apologized to a shepherd, nearly spun into the fountain, and was saved by Tessa, who laughed so softly that it did not wound his dignity beyond repair, mostly. After the dancing came silence, not sudden. He gathered. People returned to the tables. Children leaned sleepily against parents. Lantern flames trembled in the cool air. Meredith rose. She held no cup, no staff, no symbol of office, only a small piece of blue ribbon. "Tonight," she said, "we remember what was never seen." One by one, people stood and spoke. Not names this time, moments. The first harvest after the erasure. The year the Northern Watch saw riders but was not discovered. The night a woman gave birth during a storm, while half the village held roof beams in place. The spring when the western road was blocked by fallen trees and no one knew whether to clear it or let the forest decide. Calvin spoke of the scribes who copied books, knowing no outsider might ever read them. Garrick spoke of watchers who stayed awake through winter nights, protecting people who never knew their names. Eleanor spoke of mothers who taught children not to fear the boundary, but not to cross it lightly. Then Rowan stood. The square became very still. He held his cup in both hands. "To those who carried blood without demanding obedience," he said. "To those who refused crowns, and those who kept the throne clean anyway." No one cheered. They bowed their heads. Aldrin felt his throat tighten. Finally, Meredith looked to him. He had not expected to speak. Of course, by now, he should have expected exactly that. He rose slowly. Every face turned toward him. "I come from places that remember loudly," he said. "Cities with bells, markets, arguments, coins, laws, towers, and men who carve their names into stone because they fear silence more than death." A few smiles flickered. "But I have never seen a place remember as carefully as this." He paused. The lanterns moved in the breeze. "I do not yet know what I will draw, or what I should tell. But I know this. Lethrain was not lost because it was small. It endured because it learned how to hold itself together when no one else was looking." The square remained quiet. Then Tessa touched her cup to the table. Once, others followed. Tap, tap, tap. Soon the sound spread, soft as rain. Not applause, acceptance. Later, after sweets of baked pear, cream, and honey, after the final songs, after children were carried home asleep, and musicians packed away their tired fiddles, Aldrin stood alone near the fountain. The feast had ended, but the air still held warmth. Invisible history, he thought, was still history, perhaps more honest than most. For it asked no statues, no conquests, no permission from kings, only that someone remember. The morning after the feast was quieter than usual, mostly because half the valley had eaten enough pudding to make ambition seem unreasonable. Aldrin woke late to pale sunlight, distant rooster noise, and the soft ache of dancing muscles. He had apparently rented for the evening, and now had to return damaged. In the courtyard, servants moved slowly. Children swept ribbon scraps from the square. Musicians nursed tired fingers. Even Brim stood in the stable doorway with the expression of a creature reconsidering every garland he had consumed. Aldrin was on his way to find tea when the western bell rang. Not the ordinary bell, not the noon remembering. This sound came sharp and uneven from the forest watchtower. 3 strikes. Pause. 3 strikes. Pause. Every person nearby froze. Then the castle changed, not into panic, into purpose. Guards crossed the courtyard at a run. A stable boy led horses from their stalls. Marith appeared at the upper steps with her cloak already fastened, because apparently custodians were born fully prepared inside locked cupboards. Rowan arrived moments later, carrying a coil of rope and an axe. Aldrin stepped toward them. "What is it?" Garrick came through the gate, breathing hard but steady. "Riders on the western road." The words moved through the courtyard like cold water. "How many?" Marith asked. 6, maybe 7, armed, not soldiers. "Merchants? No packs. Scouts? Maybe." Aldrin felt every cheerful memory of the feast tighten inside him. Outsiders. After generations of waiting, warning, singing, hiding and sweeping bridges when no one watched, the world had finally remembered how to knock. Badly. Marith turned to Aldrin. "Did anyone follow you?" "No," he answered too quickly, then searched himself for doubt. The charcoal burner, the old road, his own tracks. Had someone noticed? Had some lord's man seen him vanish into the forest and decided curiosity was cheaper than wisdom? "I do not know," he admitted. Marith nodded, not accusing. Honesty in Lethrain seemed to be treated like a useful tool rather than an ornament for speeches. They climbed to the western watch. Blind before midday, moving through hidden paths, Aldrin now recognized only enough to understand how lost he would have been alone. From the ridge, he saw them, 7 riders. They had halted near the old boundary stones, their horses stamped in the leaf litter. One rider wore a red cloak trimmed with black. Another carried a crossbow. 2 had short swords. 1 held a rolled parchment tube, not bandits then, or not merely bandits. Bandits rarely carried documents unless they were unusually committed to administration. Garrick crouched beside Aldrin. "Do you know them?" Aldrin narrowed his eyes. "No." Marith watched silently. Below, the red-cloaked rider dismounted and inspected the stone marker. He brushed away moss, leaned closer, then spoke to the others. One laughed, another pointed toward the hidden path. They had found something, not the road entire, but enough. Rowan's jaw tightened. "If they enter the valley—" "They may not," Marith said. "May not is a hope wearing formal shoes." Aldrin glanced at him. "Good phrase. Bad moment." The riders began leading their horses forward, slowly. Garrick gestured to 2 watchers hidden among trees. One slipped away, silent as falling shade. "What happens now?" Aldrin whispered. "We discourage them," Marith said. The discouragement began with the marsh. A watcher upstream shifted a small sluice gate, redirecting water across the lower path. The riders reached what looked like firm ground and found their boots sinking into cold mud. One cursed loudly enough to startle birds from branches. Then came the horn, not a battle horn, a hollow wooden call from deeper in the forest, low and mournful. The horses grew nervous. Another horn answered from a different direction.
Then another. The riders turned in their saddles, confused. Aldrin admired the effect tremendously. Nothing frightened armed men quite like being unable to decide whether they were surrounded by enemies, ghosts, or very musical trees. But the red-cloaked rider did not retreat. He raised one hand. His companions quieted.
Then he shouted, "In the name of Lord Vare of Marrodin, we seek passage through old Crownlands." Mareth's face changed. Not fear, recognition. Aldrin knew the name Marrodin vaguely. A border lordship west of the old trade road. Ambitious, poor in fertile land, rich in men who believed every hill secretly belonged to them. "Old Crownlands," Rowan muttered. "So they know something," Aldrin said. "They know a phrase," Mareth replied. "That may be worse." The red-cloaked rider opened his parchment and continued shouting. "By recovered charter and lawful inheritance, these roads fall under Marrodin protection." Tessa, crouched nearby, whispered, "Protection sounds expensive." "It usually is," Aldrin said. A curious legal absurdity crossed his mind. Medieval lords adored old charters the way dogs adored buried bones. A scrap of parchment, half-eaten by damp and witnessed by men dead for 2 centuries, could inspire lawsuits, raids, marriages, taxes, and several extremely boring arguments in Latin. Nothing made greed feel respectable like faded ink. Mareth stood. Garrick caught her sleeve. "Custodian. They must not wander in blind." Rowan stood with her. "Then I go too." "No." "Yes." For a moment the two looked at one another, custodian and uncroned heir, duty facing duty across a few inches of forest air. Mareth exhaled. "Stay behind me." "That is not agreement." "It is what you are getting." They descended to the boundary with Garrick, Tessa, Aldrin, and 4 guards. The riders had managed to pull one horse from the mud and were debating whether the forest itself had become legally inconvenient. Mareth stepped into view. The riders fell silent. She looked like no queen, no crown, no jewels, no raised sword, just an old woman in a green cloak standing where a forgotten kingdom met the hungry world. The red-cloaked rider bowed shallowly. "Good woman, we did not know settlements remained here. That much is clear. I am Sir Halvin, sworn man of Lord Vare." "Then you may return to him." His smile hardened. "We carry claim. You carry paper. Lawful paper. Wet paper if you stay in that marsh much longer." One of the riders coughed, possibly hiding laughter. Sir Halvin did not enjoy that. Rowan stepped slightly forward. "This land is kept." "By whom?" Halvin asked. "Those who live on it." That is not an answer recognized by courts. It is recognized by fields. Aldrin almost applauded, which would have been unhelpful but emotionally satisfying. Halvin's eyes moved over Rowan, then Mareth, then the guards. He understood enough to become cautious. "We do not seek trouble." "Armed men on hidden roads rarely seek poetry," Mareth said. "We seek confirmation." Lord Vare's scholars found reference to a crown road lost after the War of 3 Crowns. If lands remain unsettled, he may claim stewardship. They are not unsettled. "So I see." His gaze sharpened. "Then your people have failed to present dues, fealty, census, levy, toll, and recognition for generations," Tessa whispered. "He brought the whole basket," Aldrin whispered back, "and none of it smells fresh." Mareth lifted her chin. "This valley owes Lord Vare nothing. That is for lawful men to decide." "No," she said softly. "That is for living people to decide." The forest seemed to hold its breath. Halvin rolled the parchment slowly. "We will report what we have seen. You have seen a dangerous marsh, poor passage, and no welcome. I have seen smoke beyond the trees. A mistake, small but real. Marith knew it. Rowan knew it. Aldrin felt it land. The outside world had glimpsed the valley, not clearly, but enough to hunger. Marith stepped closer. Sir Halvin, listen carefully. The road ahead will not carry horses. The forest will not favor strangers. The people beyond it will not submit to claims pulled from forgotten dust. Go home, Halvin mounted. For now. The riders withdrew slowly, angry and muddy. No arrows flew, no swords were drawn. Yet Aldrin felt as though a gate had cracked open somewhere deep beneath the day. When the last rider vanished among the trees, no one moved for several breaths. Then Rowan said very quietly, "They will return." Marith nodded. Yes. Below the ridge, hidden beyond forest and field, Lethrain still glowed in afternoon peace. But peace, Aldrin now understood, had heard its name called from outside, and it could no longer pretend the world had forgotten forever. The valley did not panic after Sir Halvin departed. It prepared. To an outsider, the change might have seemed almost invisible. Children still carried water. Bakers still kneaded dough before sunrise. Shepherds still led flocks into the meadows. The castle bells still marked the hours with their familiar calm. But Aldrin had lived in Lethrain long enough to notice the quieter differences. The Western Watch changed shifts more often. Extra lanterns appeared near crossroads. Messengers walked with greater purpose. The castle's council chamber remained occupied long after sunset. Peace had not disappeared. It had simply become alert. Marith summoned Aldrin that evening. When he entered the council chamber, he found not only Marith, but Rowan, Tessa, Garrick, Mara, the blacksmith, Brother Calvin, Eleanor, Pell the beekeeper, and representatives from nearly every village in the valley. The circular table was full. No throne overlooked them, only candles. Marith gestured toward an empty chair. You should hear this. I am not one of your people. No, she said, but you are part of the question. That was not a comfortable place to be. The meeting began without ceremony. Calvin unrolled copies of old records. Garrick described the riders' movements in careful detail. Mara reported how many spearheads could be forged within a month if necessary. The numbers were reassuring, then slightly less reassuring. Finally, Rowan stood. If Lord Vare returns, he said, he will not return alone. Several heads nodded. He found enough to awaken curiosity. Pell folded his hands. Curiosity spreads. So does ambition, Mara replied. Eleanor looked toward Aldrin. And maps. The room grew quiet. Aldrin understood immediately. They were thinking what he had been trying not to think. If the existence of Lethrain became known, what then? Marith spoke softly. For centuries we asked one question. She rested her hand upon the table. How do we remain hidden? She looked around the room. Now we must ask another. Should we? Silence settled like fresh snow. No one answered immediately. There was no obvious reply. That, Aldrin suspected, was why wise people preferred councils over kings. Kings often answered too quickly. An elderly shepherd rose first. My grandfather hid from armies. He smiled faintly. My grandson has never seen one. I would like to keep it that way. Several people murmured agreement. Then Tessa spoke. If outsiders come peacefully? They rarely stay peaceful, Mara muttered. Sometimes they do. Sometimes wolves become vegetarian. A few quiet chuckles softened the tension. Rowan leaned forward. If we remain hidden, Lord Vare may keep searching. If we reveal ourselves, Pell answered, others will come. Merchants, tax collectors, priests, scholars, nobles, relatives no one wanted. That last suggestion somehow received the strongest agreement. Aldrin noticed something remarkable. No one interrupted. No one shouted. Disagreement existed without becoming insult. That alone made Lethrain unlike half the courts he had visited. Marith eventually turned toward him. You have seen both worlds. I have. What would happen if we appeared on maps again? He wished the question had been easier. Instead, it was painfully honest. You would become real. We already are. Yes, he searched for better words. I mean real to kingdoms. The distinction mattered. Roads would be repaired. Trade would come. So would opportunity. And danger, he nodded. Both. Brother Calvin adjusted one of his manuscripts. Our library would no longer be hidden. No. Our history could finally be copied elsewhere. Yes. Our secrets would stop being secrets. Also, yes. The old scribe sighed. I dislike balanced questions. So do I. A curious historical thought drifted into Aldrin's mind. Throughout the medieval world, isolated communities often faced the same dilemma when new roads opened. Trade brought salt, cloth, tools, books, and news. It also brought disease, taxes, politics, disputes over land, and officials who suddenly became fascinated by people they had happily ignored for generations. Roads connected, roads complicated. Sometimes they accomplished both before lunchtime. As evening deepened, villagers continued speaking. A young shepherd dreamed of seeing distant cities. An elderly potter feared forgetting old traditions. A miller hoped for better iron. A healer wished for rare medicines unavailable within the valley. One woman quietly admitted she had always wondered what the sea looked like. No one mocked her. Several confessed they wondered too. For the first time, Aldrin realized something uncomfortable. Lethrain had not chosen isolation. Its ancestors had. These people had inherited that choice. Some embraced it. Others questioned it privately. Neither feeling was wrong. Marith seemed to recognize this as well. She stood slowly. When Edrian vanished, he made the best decision he could. She looked toward the empty chair where no ruler sat. He did not command us forever. The room listened. We have honored his sacrifice, she paused. But honoring the past does not require imprisoning the future. Those words seemed to ripple across every face. Rowan looked down thoughtfully. Tessa smiled sadly. Even Garrick appeared to consider them. Aldrin found himself staring at the polished table. How many generations had gathered here? How many impossible decisions had been made without certainty? Perhaps wisdom was not knowing the correct answer. Perhaps it was accepting that every answer cost something. Late that night, after the council ended, Aldrin wandered into the castle gardens. Moonlight silvered the paths. Fountains whispered quietly. The valley slept beneath scattered lanterns. Rowan joined him after a while. Neither spoke immediately. Finally, Rowan asked, "If you leave, I will. What will you do?" Aldrin looked toward the surrounding forest. "I don't know. That is an honest answer. It is the only one I possess." Rowan nodded. "When I was little, I believed the outside world was made entirely of castles. It is mostly mud. I suspected as much. You would like parts of it. I might. You would dislike other parts. I probably would." They both smiled. After a long silence, Rowan asked the question Aldrin had quietly feared. "If you draw us..." He stopped. Aldrin finished it. someone will come. Yes, if you do not, someone may come anyway. Again. Yes. The dilemma refused to shrink. Above them, clouds drifted slowly across the moon. Somewhere an owl called. Far below, one last window darkened as a family finally went to sleep. The valley rested peacefully. Yet beneath that peace, every heart now carried the same uncertainty. The forgotten kingdom had reached the edge of its long silence, not because it had failed, not because its people had grown careless, simply because time, like every traveler, eventually found even the quietest roads. And soon, Lethrain would have to decide whether its greatest act of remembrance would be continuing to hide, or choosing, at last, to be seen. Aldrin left Lethrain 3 mornings after the council. No feast marked his leaving, no bells rang differently, no grand procession followed him to the road, which was a mercy because farewells become difficult enough without everyone standing around looking meaningful in damp grass. Still, people came. Tessa brought him a packet of dried apples and a folded square of blue cloth. Mara handed him a small iron clasp shaped like a crown, then warned him not to lose it because she disliked wasted metal. Pell gave him a little clay jar of honey. Calvin gave him no book, which seemed personally painful, but instead pressed into his hand a single copied line from Edrian's record. Remembering is not possession. Rowan walked with him to the western boundary. Brim carried the packs and behaved as though the entire kingdom had been created mainly to provide him with emotional closure and oats. At the old stones, Aldrin turned back. Lethrain lay hidden beyond the rise, invisible already behind trees, mist, and distance. Tessa embraced him first. "Do not make us smaller than we are," she said. "I won't." Mara clasped his shoulder, hard enough to rearrange several bones. "Do not make us larger, either." "I'll try." Rowan waited until the others stepped away. "What will you tell them?" Aldrin looked at the forest path ahead. "Less than I know." "That sounds like a mapmaker's answer." "It is." "Is it enough?" "No." Rowan smiled faintly. "Honest again." Aldrin reached into his satchel and withdrew his own regional map. It still showed blank hills where Lethrain breathed and worked and remembered. He had not changed it. Not yet. "I will not draw the road," he said. Rowan's expression softened. "But you will speak?" "When silence becomes betrayal." "That is a narrow bridge." "Yes, try not to fall." "I make no heroic promises." Their farewell was quiet. No vows carved into stone. No dramatic clasp of forearms like men in songs who apparently never feel awkward. Just a nod, a shared understanding. Then Aldrin crossed the boundary. The forest received him without ceremony. For hours, Garrick guided him silently through the confusing paths, marsh edges, thorn bends, hidden stones, and old road fragments. At last the woodsman stopped near a familiar bridge. Beyond it, the outside road waited, rougher, lonelier, less carefully swept. Garrick pointed west. "You can find your way from here." "I think so. Thinking is how men get lost. Then I will proceed with fear." "Better." The woodsman turned to leave, then paused. "If riders ask, you saw bad marsh, old stones, and nothing worth wet boots. That is nearly true. Best kind of lie." And then he was gone. Aldrin stood alone beside Brim, listening to the ordinary forest return. Birds, leaves, water, no hidden bells, no distant songs, only the world he had known before, continuing as though nothing had happened. That was the cruelest part. Outside Lethrain, The day did not feel changed, but Aldrin was. By evening, he reached the charcoal burner's hut near the old trade road. The same elderly man sat outside, turning a piece of blackened wood in his hands. He looked up. "You went too far." "I did." "You came back." "I did that too." The old man studied him. "Did you see it?" Aldrin sat on a stump. "I saw enough." The charcoal burner nodded slowly. "My grandfather said his grandfather heard bells once." "He may have." "Will men come?" "Yes." The old man closed his eyes. "Shame." "Perhaps." "Perhaps." Aldrin thought of the council chamber, the sea dream, the healer's wish for rare medicines, the children writing names into wax. Not every door opens into ruin. "No," the old man said, "but plenty do." Aldrin could not argue. A curious memory came to him then. In some villages, travelers leaving a protected boundary would turn their cloaks inside out, not from magic exactly, but from the belief that roads could cling to a person. A reversed cloak confused whatever sorrow or spirit wished to follow. Aldrin did not turn his cloak, but he understood the impulse. He slept poorly that night, not from cold, not from danger, from responsibility. In the morning he continued toward Merredin. He did not seek Lord Vere, but Merredin's men found him. Two riders approached near a toll bridge, recognized his satchel, and asked whether he was the mapmaker seen traveling the western road weeks earlier. Aldrin smiled blandly. Mapmakers learned blandness from clerks and mushrooms. Both survived by seeming uninteresting. "I travel many roads." "Did you cross old crown lands?" "I crossed old mud." "Did you find settlements?" "I found trees." "Smoke?" "Charcoal burners make smoke." That was true. One rider frowned. The other looked bored. Bored men were safer than clever ones. They let him pass. But Aldrin knew the questions would continue. By the time he reached the market town beyond Merredin's border, rumor had already arrived before him. Men spoke of lost roads, hidden farms, old claims, and Lord Vere's recovered charter. No one knew details, which did not prevent anyone from speaking confidently. Rumor, Aldrin reflected, was the only crop that grew faster when watered with ignorance. At an inn, he heard merchants debating whether a forgotten valley might offer timber, pasture, silver, or unpaid taxes. Unpaid taxes received the most excitement, naturally. Aldrin ate silently, then went to his room and unfolded parchment. Not his official map, a private page. He drew Lethrain from memory. Not the roads that led there, not the marsh passage, not the watch blinds. Only the valley's shape, the river, the castle hill, the villages, the orchards, the fountain. At the bottom, he wrote one word, Lethrain. Then he folded the page and sealed it. Not for sale, not for kings, for proof. Because to erase the kingdom again entirely felt wrong, but to reveal it carelessly felt worse. Days later, Aldrin departed eastward, carrying less certainty than he had ever possessed. Behind him, Lord Vere's men sharpened their claims. Ahead, courts waited with their loud halls, greedy questions, and polished lies. And somewhere between them, hidden beneath trees and memory, a kingdom trusted him to know the difference between telling a story and handing someone a key. Aldrin did not return to any capital immediately. Instead, he did what mapmakers do when the weight of a single place becomes too large to carry comfortably in the mind. He walked until the world stopped feeling like it was pressing on one specific memory. He followed river roads east, slept in grain lofts, traded sketches for meals, and listened more than he spoke.
to most travelers. He was simply another ink-stained wanderer with too many questions and boots that had given up hope of ever being clean again. But inside him, Lethrain remained, not as a destination, as a problem that refused to shrink. In the third week, he reached a city large enough that it considered its own noise, a form of architecture. Marrodon's capital, stone walls, crowded bridges, markets stacked with cloth, ironwork, salted fish, and spices that smelled like someone had accidentally broken a small miracle. And, most importantly, rumor. Rumor had arrived before Aldrin again, as it often did when truth was still putting on its shoes. At the eastern gate, guards glanced at his satchel. Mapmaker? Yes, you're expected. That is rarely good news. You'll find it inside to be equally accurate. Inside the city, everything moved faster than necessary. Merchants shouted prices as though silence might cause profit loss. Children ran errands with the urgency of people escaping invisible deadlines. Noble messengers rode through streets as if walking might imply humility. Aldrin noticed notices, posters, requests, claims. One parchment was pinned repeatedly along the main avenue. Notice of recovered border territory by authority of Lord Vere of Marrodon. It described old crown lands, abandoned valley settlement, and rights of stewardship pending confirmation. No mention of Lethrain, only absence dressed as legality. Aldrin stopped reading halfway through. Not because it was unclear, because it was too familiar. In the Royal Hall of Marrodon, he was received quickly. Lord Vere did not look like a villain. That was almost always the first disappointment in political life. He was a man in his late middle years, with careful clothing, tired eyes, and the posture of someone who had spent too long convincing others that confidence could be inherited. He gestured for Aldrin to sit. You are the mapmaker who crossed the Western Road. I am a mapmaker who crosses many roads. That one is of particular interest. Many roads are of particular interest to someone currently interested in them. A pause. Vere smiled thinly. You are careful. I draw things that remain after arguments end. Then you understand why I summoned you. Aldrin did. Men like Vere did not seek truth. They sought confirmation. He would be asked to turn memory into permission. Maps were dangerous that way. A line drawn in ink could become a justification for steal. Vere leaned forward. My scholars found reference to a valley once part of ancient crown holdings. It appears to have been removed from official record. Records are sometimes incomplete. Yes, Vere said, but not in such a convenient shape. Aldrin said nothing. The Lord studied him. You have been there. It was not a question. Aldrin chose honesty, but carefully measured honesty, like a cook adding salt to a dish that could still be ruined by enthusiasm. I passed through forests and villages. Did you see settlement? Yes. Names? Yes. Vere's eyes sharpened. Then it exists. It exists, Aldrin agreed. The room quieted. That was the moment everything in the hall shifted, not loudly, but decisively, because existence, once confirmed, becomes negotiable in the minds of ambitious men. Vere stood. Then it will be recorded properly, taxed properly, governed properly, a forgotten holding reclaimed for lawful order. Aldrin felt something cold settle in his chest. You will find that difficult. I have overcome difficult before. Not this kind. Vere smiled as though this was a challenge he enjoyed. Mapmaker, I require your assistance. Draw me the road. Confirm the valley's position. Your mark will legitimize my claim. There it was. Ink as authority. Lines as permission. Aldrin had expected it. He had feared it, and now it stood in front of him, wearing polite language. He thought of Rowan, of Merith, of children writing names carefully in wax, of empty bowls waiting for guests who might never arrive, of bells that remembered people so they would not forget themselves. He also thought of Sir Halvin, mud-soaked and confused, trying to turn curiosity into entitlement. Aldrin finally spoke. "If I draw it, others will come." "They already will," Vare replied. "Not like this. That is speculation." "No," Aldrin said quietly. "That is experience." The Lord's patience thinned. "You are a cartographer. You do not decide policy." "No," Aldrin agreed, "but I decide what becomes simple enough for people like you to turn into policy." Silence. The air in the hall felt tighter now, like a map folded too many times. Vare stepped closer. "Refuse me, and I will find another mapmaker. Perhaps. And they will draw it." "Perhaps," Aldrin met his gaze. "But they will not have seen it." That landed, not as emotion, as weight. Because there was a difference between drawing a place and having stood in it while it breathed around you. Vare studied him for a long moment. Then he spoke more softly. "What is it you protect so fiercely? Gold? A secret court? Refugees?" Aldrin almost smiled. If only it were simpler. "I protect the fact that it is still deciding what it wants to be." That was the closest truth he could offer, without opening a door too wide. Vare turned away. "You are dismissed." Aldrin stood. At the door he paused. "One more thing." Vare did not look back. "If you search for a lost valley," Aldrin said, "you may find it." "I intend to. Then be careful what you name it when you do." Outside, the city continued unchanged. Markets shouted, coins clinked, children ran. Life, indifferent as ever, moved forward. But Aldrin now understood something that would not leave him. Lethrain was no longer only hidden in forest and marsh. It was now hidden in decision, in hesitation, in whether ink would be allowed to become permission. And somewhere behind him, in a valley that had survived by being forgotten, a kingdom waited for a world that was beginning, slowly, dangerously, to remember how to look. Aldrin left Marrowden before dawn, not because he was fleeing, and not because he had won, but because staying any longer would have turned thought into pressure, and pressure has a way of convincing ink to behave like steel. The city gates opened with the same indifference they had closed with the day before. Guards barely looked at him. Merchants were already arguing in alleys. A baker shouted at a cart driver for existing too loudly in front of his shop. The world continued. That, Aldrin realized, was its most persistent feature. He walked east for days, not toward Lethrain, not away from it, somewhere in between. Brim followed without complaint, which in itself felt like a quiet judgment. Even the mule seemed to understand that some decisions were no longer about roads, but about what those roads would eventually become. On the fourth evening, Aldrin stopped beside a river. The water moved steadily, unbothered by kingdoms, borders, or arguments in distant halls. He unfolded his map, the private one. Lethrain still sat there, carefully drawn from memory. Valley, castle, villages, river, orchards, a kingdom rendered in ink that now felt heavier than iron. He traced the lines with a single finger. "If I leave you blank," he said quietly, "you remain hidden." A wind moved across the water. "If I draw you," he continued, "you become a destination." Brim snorted as if offering no useful opinion on philosophy. Aldrin smiled faintly. "You are no help at all." The mule blinked slowly. It was, at least, consistent.
That night, he did not sleep much. Not from fear, from clarity. He saw all outcomes now, not as stories, but as consequences. If he mapped Lethrain, Lord Vare would not be the only one who came. Others would follow. Merchants, claimants, curious nobles, scholars, men who turned curiosity into ownership and ownership into justification. If he did not, the valley would remain hidden until someone else found it, less careful, less restrained, possibly less kind. Silence was not safety. Revelation was not safety either. The choice refused to become simple. At dawn, Aldrin rose and made a fire small enough to avoid notice from anything but patience itself. He placed his private map beside it. For a long moment, he stared at Lethrain, the valley that had learned to remember itself because the world forgot it. A place built on absence that had become a form of care. He thought of Meredith's steady voice, of Rowan's refusal, of Tessa's ribbon, of Calvin's ink-stained devotion, of a throne that existed only to remind people what absence cost. Then he spoke softly, as if the river might listen. "You were never meant to be owned by ink." He folded the map once, twice, not carefully, not gently, but decisively, and he did not burn it. He simply kept it, because destroying memory is just another kind of control. Instead, he took a separate sheet, fresh parchment. He began to draw, not the valley, not the hidden roads, not the marsh, not the watch blinds. He drew the world around it, the forest, the ridges, the marshlands, the broken trade roads, the places that made passage uncertain, not impossible. He marked something new, a blank space, unnamed, unclaimed, not erased, not revealed, held. Aldrin understood finally what kind of mapmaker he had become. Not one who exposed hidden kingdoms, not one who buried them, but one who reminded the world that some places existed between those two choices. Brim watched him finish, and then lowered his head as if approving something without understanding it. "Good enough," Aldrin murmured. The river continued flowing. Somewhere far beyond forests and ridges, Lethrain still existed, unchanged for the moment, unaware of the storm of decisions circling it like weather that had not yet decided where to fall. Aldrin rolled the new map carefully, not as declaration, not as surrender, but as restraint. Then he stood, slung his satchel over his shoulder, and began walking again. Not toward kingdoms, not away from them, but toward the long, uncertain space where stories become either danger or protection. And behind him, on a riverbank that would remember nothing of this moment, the water kept moving forward, as it always had, as it always would, quietly erasing footprints without ever asking whether they should have been there at all.